Hello, welcome to the Bible study. My name is Kent Philpott, and we are, of course, Cheryl in the Gospel of John. We're going to be looking at the very last verse of chapter 7, then the first 11 verses of chapter 8, and the story is the woman caught in adultery. Now, this particular piece has caused a lot of confusion because in the very earliest manuscripts, like the Papyrus 6675, Codex Sinaiticus, and Vaticanus, are not in that Greek versions of the New Testament, the Greek Bible. So it appears in Codex Beza, but that is a 5th century, actually 6th century document. It appears in a number of other places. There are other manuscripts that do have it, but it is pretty apparent that something happened to it, and whether or not it was originally in the Gospel of John has been open to question. But let me give you a few reasons why people like myself include it. It fits with the next passage about Jesus being, "I am the light of the world," because here's a woman who was walking in darkness. It fits into the ministry of Jesus. We have a prodigal or wayward son. Now we have a prodigal, wayward female. Jesus is in character, perfectly fits in. Fits in with the scribes and the Pharisees and their attempts to discredit and get rid of Jesus. One of the early followers of Jesus, who was actually a disciple of John, a man named Papias, Eusebius, writing in the 4th century, the first historian of the Christian church, mentions Papias and mentions this particular passage of the woman caught in adultery. Augustine, later on, wrote that certain individuals removed the passage because he didn't want people to think that women could be encouraged to be immoral. In other words, there was a gender issue here with this book, this little passage. But most people over the years have accepted it as a part of the Gospel of John. Okay, now the first verse we're going to have is chapter 7, verse 53 says, "They went each to his own house." Now this was events that you knew about from last week's program. Took place in the temple, the Feast of the Booths or Tabernacles or Ingathering, one of the 3 great feasts of Israel where masses of people showed up. And so the verse says they went each to his own house. So somehow the events that had taken place, they're over now. People have gone home. And then verse 1 in chapter 8 says, "But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives." Now, the Mount of Olives was very close to the temple. Actually, at the top part of that Mount of Olives was in higher elevation than the temple was, Mount Zion. And so it was a garden kind of thing. It was where the Garden of Gethsemane was. A lot of people had gardens there. But also very close to there was Bethany. And that's where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived. So there's some question as to exactly where Jesus went. Could have been any number of different places. But he's by himself. He's retired from the night. And so verse 2 we find early in the morning. Notice early, not just in the morning, but early in the morning. Getting there, he came again to the temple. It says, all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. Sitting down was the way that the teachers taught. They didn't stand and deliver, but they sat down, like I'm sitting down. I'm filming 4 programs at once. This is the first of 4. and I would be worn out by about the second one. So I sit down, and that was a common mode of teaching at the temple and also in the synagogues. So that was the standard. So he came to the temple, and notice the little phrase, all the people came to him. Of course, all, you would not take that in a literal sense, but many people came to him. The people that were in the temple, many flocked around him. Now, those words have a lot of import, because here's this young Galilean now, remember, Galilean, untaught, unschooled, is not identified with any religious party, have not graduated from any rabbinical school, and the people are flocking around him now to the religious authorities, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the scribes. Well, that's going to be a problem. On the one hand, there's going to be jealousy. There will be envy. And now we're talking about one of the, a couple of the 7 deadly sins, those sins that go so unchecked in our own culture, if you start reflecting very much on that. But that's what they were experiencing. They were upset. Here's Jesus. All these people are flocking to him. Now, some people have pointed out that they were concerned that because of the numbers of people attracted to Jesus, they might run into trouble with the Roman authorities. This was an era when various people would declare themselves to be the arrival of the Messiah. I'm the Messiah. And they would gather people together, and they would go in rebellion against Rome. So some have said it was a protective measure, but from the basic language that we see in these passages in the Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I think the better idea is that they were jealous, that they were envious of Jesus. Verse 3, the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. Now, I want to describe who the scribes and the Pharisees were. The Pharisees were a religious party, had been in process of formation for about 2 centuries or maybe a little bit longer. Pharisees means separated ones. They claimed because of their study of the Scripture that they were above the rest. They were separated. They were cleaner. They were more holy. At the time of the first century here, estimates are there were approximately 3,000 of them, and they were the teachers. They taught in the synagogues. The temple was not their domain, but it was the synagogues. Now the scribes could have been Pharisees, or maybe not. They maybe went their own way. But the scribes, notice the word scribe is somebody who writes. They would write the legal documents. They were the lawyers of their day. If you were going to sell a piece of land, you would go to the scribe and would write a certificate of sale. And a certificate of divorce or marriage, you required a scribe. And so these were the lawyers, and here they're combined. Their interests would be identical. Their whole life would be upset because of this young Galilean named Jesus. So they brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. Now this elicits a number of questions. For instance, where's the man? How could they do that? Notice it says, who had been caught in adultery. It didn't say who caught them and where are these witnesses. And there had to be a number of witnesses to see it in the act in order for this to be chargeable against somebody. So we don't have a man, but we just have the woman. It's pretty useless to go on and on and on about that, since we really don't know. By the way, the word in the Greek for woman indicates that she was married. It was a word used for a married woman. So that much we have. One of the commentators that I depend upon mentioned that during the Feast of Booths, there could be some wild revelry. Wild revelry. Now, I don't know all that means, but one writer I read said, well, almost anything could happen. So maybe it wouldn't have been so difficult for them to find this kind of circumstance. So what they did was, the next little phrase is, and placing her in the midst. They take her and they put her in the midst right in front of everybody. Now this must have been a very shaming experience for this woman. Apparently they didn't care anything about that. Now I must confess that some people have suggested that this woman was put up to it. But it doesn't seem that way by the majority of commentators, both in the centuries gone by and contemporary, that this was a contrived setup, but that it was, as reported, she had been caught in adultery. And so they placed her in the midst. So they didn't much care about how she felt or what trauma, emotional trauma, she might experience. And they said to him, verse 4, Teacher. Now they use this honorific title which Jesus had not earned. Jesus did not refrain or prevent people from using the term, but I would imagine if you'd asked him, he would not have liked being called rabbi. I suppose that he thought, well, let's not worry about it too much. We'll just let that go. But he was not an official rabbi in terms of the practice of that day. Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. So we have the second statement again, in the very act. Verse 5 says, now in the law, this would have been the law we find in what we call the Torah or the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, those law books. And they say, now in the law, Moses commanded to stone such women. Well, that's not exactly true. Someone who could be stoned would have been a woman who had been betrothed to be married and then engaged in sexual intercourse with someone other than her, the one she was to be married to, that she was betrothed to. Other than that, they were not to be stoned. Frankly, they would be strangled. But anyway, killed. They took it in that kind of way. When I presented this at Miller Avenue Baptist Church in Mill Valley, where I'm pastor, someone said that is anti-female. That was genderism, all of those laws that existed at that point. And I could not help but agree in so many ways. I remember in seminary when in studying the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, people would say, well, this was meant to be protective of the women because in that era, women needed extra protection because you didn't have social safety. You couldn't dial 911. You couldn't. Those kind of institutions just were not in place. Public safety institutes, and so they built a very stringent laws that were designed to protect women. And I got to be honest with you. I'm not sure which way I want to go right now. If you were to question me and say, "Come on, Philpott, what do you really think?" I would stumble around somewhat, and I'm not sure I have an adequate answer. So, but it was the rabbinical tradition, not the law, but in the rabbinical tradition that went on, eventually emerged into what we call the Talmud, where the word stoning for this incident is actually used for a woman caught in adultery. but they say the law, which at that point would be not right. But in any case, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Then they say to him, so what do you say? It's hard for us to imagine the confrontational nature of this whole event. But it would have been high anxiety, I would imagine. And here's this young guy, and you've got all of these experts on the law, the official Judaism people right there in your face, and in the temple during a feast with crowds of maybe thousands watching. Here Jesus, he's alone. The apostles are not present with him. And what a traumatic event it must have been for Jesus. Now, what are they after? What are these people attempting to do to Jesus? Well, some say that if Jesus said, yes, stone her, she should be stoned to death. Well, the reaction to the people would have been very severe, but very severe. To have this woman stoned to death, they would have dragged her outside of the temple and stoned her to death if Jesus had complied with that. If he said no, you can't stone her, well, he would have been breaking what they said, the law of Moses. Well, you're breaking the law of Moses. How can you be anybody, despite the miracles that are being reported about you? You've broken the law of Moses. And then another point on if they had gone in and stoned her, well, the Romans held the right of capital punishment. In other words, to condemn someone to death. And Jesus would have violated that. So Jesus was right in the middle. Either way he went, he was going to end up in some real trouble. And it apparently is what these folks were after, a way of getting rid of Jesus, or at least tarnishing him as being against the law of Moses. So what do you say? Like to have heard the tone, like to have seen it. Verse 6. This they said to test him, that they may have some charge to bring against him. That's what I've just got through explaining. I should have waited until I read that. But so they were looking. The writer of this piece, whether it's John, and I think it was John. I adhere to the idea of the lost leaf. I don't know. In any case, what happened was Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. Now, he's already seated. Maybe he was seated in teaching them. And we find he sat down in verse 2. So he's bending down, he's leaning over and wrote with his fingers on the ground. Now, they're in the temple, and I've long wondered how it is that he would write on the ground if they're in the temple and the stone there. Well, from other accounts I have found that it would have been very dusty. There would have been dust everybody, all of the thousands, tens of thousands of people walking through, that there would have been some kind of dust. So he bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. I've seen artist renditions of that sort of thing, and I've not been convinced that it's been captured. I've not seen anything that I felt that really captured the moment. Somehow he's writing and people are looking at what he's writing. Must have been gotten behind him, which is another thing that's very tricky to try to express if you're trying to do what I'm trying to do. I've wondered for a long time how I'm going to convey this, and I never did arrive at anything. I'm just doing the best I can on this. So he bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And of course, the question is, what did he write? Some will suggest, well, he's writing out the Ten Commandments. That sounds like a real possibility. Some others may say, will say that he was writing down the sins of the scribes and the Pharisees. Maybe looking at jealousy, pride, envy, stealing, and so on. Who knows? Maybe he was writing down some of those things, maybe naming some of the people. And we don't know how long this event takes place. We haven't anybody with a clock saying for 20 minutes Jesus bent over and wrote. We don't know the time period here at all. Wish we had. By the way, in those days, the writers, because the writing materials were so rare and so costly, the early manuscripts, they wrote from, they had no room at the bottom, on the left or the right, the bottom. They went all the way across, no margin at all. And that was how the early copies of the Greek Bible were done. And so we don't really know what exactly went on here and who saw what. But verse 7, and as they continued to ask him, notice they continued to ask him. They just didn't ask once. So what do you say? They said over and over as they continued. That's a verb form that means they were constantly on him. They were probably pretty angrily yelling at him. So what do you say? What do you say? What do you say? Jesus calmly, he stood up and he said to them, let him who was without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. Famous passage. I love the passage. He who is without sin be the first to throw. I could never throw a stone. The longer I've been a Christian, the more a sinner I know myself to be. I'm probably not sinning as much as I used to, I think, but I'm much more aware now of my own sinfulness. That's how most all Christians will respond if you were to put that question to them. They likely would not say, well, I'm getting more pure and holier all the time. I got to tell you, I've never heard a Christian say anything like that. It's always the reverse. Always the reverse. So these are not going to be young people, these scribes and Pharisees. They're going to be the elders amongst the group. In fact, often they are referred to as elders in Scripture. And so they have a knowledge of life and some knowledge of themselves. However, when you are in a religion that is based upon doing things that are right so you can be commended by God and others, you have a tendency to learn how to hide, and your pride, you can get carried away thinking it all depends on how I act, how others see me act, without getting into what's in your heart and your mind. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, if you look on a woman to lust after her, you have committed adultery already in your heart. If you are angry with your brother, you have committed murder in your heart. So Jesus understood it's not a matter of action alone, but what's in your heart and your mind. And I think that has to do with somehow of what Jesus was writing. So, without sin, to their credit, these people walked away. It says in verse 8, and once more, after he said that, he bent down and wrote on the ground. Once more. He did it twice. I had forgotten about that when I came to study this passage to preach it just recently. I had forgotten about the second time now. That's interesting. He did it a second time. I imagine that what he did was he wrote out some more sins, some sins of the heart, some sins of the mind, not just those obvious things like being caught in adultery. What leads, all the sins, there's always something going on internally that leads to those. I better hurry on. Verse 9. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. An incredible story. I'm trying to learn how to write film scripts, and I'd love to try to capture this. I would not attempt it. I'd never be ever good enough to do that. But they went away, beginning with the older ones. Perhaps they understood a little bit more about the whole circumstance of sin being of the heart and the mind. So Jesus is with the woman. Verse 10, Jesus stood up now. He stands up and said to her, "Woman." Now that is a term of dignity. He's saying to her, not anything other than that, but a legitimate public term of appropriateness. Where are they? They went away. Is no one condemned you? I imagine he says, where'd they all go? She said, no one, Lord. She uses a very interesting term, koie. What kind of meaning we want to attach to that? It would probably be unsafe to say. And Jesus said, neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more. Now, Jesus, I believe, takes it for fact that the woman was caught in adultery. I think it was a real event, and that's just the way it worked. He understood that, and he just said, from now on, sin no more. One of the questions is, could this have been Mary Magdalene? Here we have in Luke 8, 1-3, it talks about, and the 12 were with him, with Jesus, and some also women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities, Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. Well, I don't think it was Mary Magdalene, but I could easily be wrong. We're never going to solve that particular issue. So we're going to just leave that an open question. There's so much more I would like to say, but we're out of time. So long.